Good evening. Welcome, and welcome again to the people who were here for the prior lecture. I'm Mary Garrison from the History Department here at the University of York, and I'm chairing this event. I'm delighted to see you all here. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Colm O'Brien. He is a former field archaeologist and university lecturer, and has excavated settlements and conducted studies on kingship sites of early medieval Northumbria. We should all remember that York was part of Northumbria long before there was such a thing as Yorkshire. He is a visiting fellow in archaeology at the University of Newcastle and a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. Tonight we are delighted to have Colm here, and he's going to talk about his latest book, co-authored with Max Adams, called Northumbria AD 367 to 867, Earth Hall, Ringcraft, and Heaven's Field. Colm, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and good evening, and thank you for coming, and thank you for those who are coming again after Michelle's tour de force there. And thank you to the organisers for inviting me. Am I audible at the back? Yeah, thank you. It's a long way to the back, before I ask. I'm going to read you something. This isn't from the book that Max and I have written, but it is relevant. And some of you may well spot what I'm reading. The place is still shown today and is held in great veneration, where Oswald, when he was about to engage in battle, set up the sign of the Holy Cross and on bended knee prayed God to send heavenly aid to his worshippers in their dire need. In fact, it is related that when a cross had been hastily made and the hole dug in which it was to stand, he seized the cross himself in the ardour of his faith, placed it in the hole, and held it upright with both hands until the soldiers heaped up the earth and fixed it in position. Thereupon he raised his voice and cried out to the whole army, "Let us all kneel together and pray the Almighty and everlasting and true God to defend us in his mercy from the proud and fierce enemy, for he knows that we are fighting in a just cause for the preservation of our whole race." They all did as he commanded, advanced against the enemy just as dawn was breaking, and gained the victory that their faith merited. Innumerable miracles of healing are known to have been wrought in the place where they prayed, doubtless as a token and memorial of the king's faith. And even to this day, many people are in the habit of cutting splinters of wood from this holy cross and putting them in water, which they then give to sick men or beasts to drink, or else they sprinkle them with it, and they are quickly restored to health. This place is called in English Heavenfield, and in Latin Caelestis Campus, a name which it certainly received in days of old as an omen of future happenings. It signified that a heavenly sign was to be erected there, a heavenly victory won, and heavenly miracles were to take place to this day. To this place, the brethren of the church at Hexham, not far away, have long made it their custom to come every year on the day before on that which King Oswald was killed, to keep vigil there for the benefit of his soul. You spot this? It's Bede. It's Bede in the ecclesiastical history talking about the arrival of Oswald there. And he goes on to talk about a priest from Hexham called Bede, who was healed as well. It's good stuff, isn't it? Good pacey narrative. It draws you in. It carries you along. And if we look at it closely, there's a very, very nice technique that he uses there. He's writing about an event that happened 100 years previously, 635. He's writing in 731. But he draws it into the present. Miracles of healing are still occurring to this day. Usque hodie. And Botelmu was healed, is still alive. It's beautiful, beautiful technique. And Bede is very, very skilled in writing narratives and bringing us along with him. But if we unpick this for a little bit, let's unpick this a little bit, because there's more to this, perhaps, than is apparent on the first reading. And I want to just highlight 4 points here. I mean, first of all, and most obviously, as far as Bede's concerned, it's quite clear, isn't it, that as far as Bede's concerned, the deep underlying significance of all this is not the battle that's happening and the restoring of the kingdom, it's the miraculous. Modern historians do not deal in the miraculous. Bede does. Secondly, this is not the only and not the first account of this episode that was committed to writing. About 30 years earlier, Edwin, the abbot of Iona, writing about St. Columcille, the founder of the monastery of Iona, did write about this episode. Why did he write about this episode? Well, Oswald was well connected with Iona. As a child, he'd been taken up to Dalriata, the northwest, the western Scotland, for protection there. And he was introduced to Iona, was educated and converted to Christianity in Iona. He came back to Northumbria with Ionan support. And after he had regained the kingship, he then reported back to Iona and got them to send a bishop, Edwin, to set up a monastery of Lindisfarne as a daughter house to Iona. The connections are very deep. Now, Edwin, writing about Columba, did refer to this episode, and there is no mention there of the cross. What he does say, though, is that on the evening before the battle, St. Columba appeared to Oswald and encouraged him to victory, and he compares Oswald there with Joshua from the Old Testament, whereas Bede, of course, is showing a new Constantine coming. So we got a very different sort of idea about that. And if Bede knew that text, and almost certainly we'd have to suppose he did know that text, there are reasons why we should think that, if he knew that text, he has chosen to ignore it, which is interesting. Third point I want to make is we have references to the brethren Hexham, which is not far away. That's fine, that they could come along from Hexham up to Heavenfield. But remember that Oswald was very much associated with Lindisfarne, and indeed after he, as I've just said, and after he was killed in battle and chopped up, his head went back to Lindisfarne and eventually was put in the coffin of St. Cuthbert. Hexham, founded by Wilfrid, was a rather sort of rival strand of Christendom and a rival ecclesiastical establishment. And I think we're seeing a bit of church politics here, if I can put it this way. The Hexham people muscling in, really, on Lindisfarne's man and getting a slice of the action. There's a bit of church politics, I think, going on there. And as for the cross itself, did it really happen like that? Well, we do have to wonder. Remember, Edwin didn't say anything about it, but let's notice that in the year 701, Pope Sergius found lying around in the Vatican a long-lost fragment of the true cross. And that prompted him to promulgate the feast and liturgy of the exaltation of the cross. And at the time he found that, it so happened that there were monks from Bede's monastery of Wearmouth Jarrow in Rome at the Vatican, and in the following year, Wilfrid, the founder of Hexham just mentioned, along with his colleague Acca, who later became Bishop of Hexham, they too were in Rome. So there's every reason to suppose that the Northumbrian church was bang up to date in the latest liturgical developments at the Vatican. Now, it has to be a distinct possibility that it was Acca who introduced the cross into Northumbrian Christendom and Northumbrian monastic practices, had it set up at Heavenfield. And because it was at Heavenfield, then the cross gets associated with Oswald, and Oswald now is back in the recesses of time, and so sort of in people's minds, oh yes, the cross is here at Heavenfield, associated with Oswald. Oswald put up this cross. Now that's a speculative reading, and you can agree with it or not agree with it, but I think it has some. I think it has some going for it. I think it has something going for it, really. So why am I saying it? Why am I saying these things? The reason I'm saying these things is simply this: that we rely so much on Bede for our knowledge of this period, and we really couldn't understand the 7th century particularly without Bede. And as a writer, he is very, very seductive. I mean, I read you that paragraph to demonstrate just how compellingly he writes. He is very, very seductive, but he is not straightforward. And we need to read Bede with our critical faculties well sharpened. One of the very interesting developments in scholarship over a generation or so is the understanding and the realization by people who study Bede's ecclesiastical history, the realization that when he came to write this, late on in his life, 731, he died in 735, he came to writing this on the back of years of writing commentaries on the scriptures. That's what he was most known for in the medieval period, as a scriptural commentator, which is why he was eventually designated a doctor of the church there. He came on the back of his scriptural scholarship. And it's quite clear that when he came to write about the English people and its kings, his ideas about what constitutes a people, what does a people mean, and what are kings, his ideas were informed and perhaps formed by his readings of the Old Testament. Case in point, particularly, in the year 716, he wrote 4 books of commentary on the book of the Old Testament that he knew as the first book of Samuel. It's now classified as the first book of Kings there. And in the first book of Samuel, Kings, we encounter the figure of Saul, king of the Israelites. And when Bede then came to bring onto the stage the first of his Northumbrian kings, Ethelfrith, he likened Ethelfrith to Saul, the king of Israel. Now one really has to ask, what possible affinities or connections could there be between this pagan warrior king at the edge of Europe, at the edge of the world, and Saul, king of the Israelites? I leave that question hanging, but for Bede, there was a connection. Right. What I propose to do is just to pick up a few themes and topics that we've written about in the book that I've written with Max Adams, and just to talk them through a little bit and read some short passages from how we treated them. I hope that's okay. So there's no whole narrative thread on this. Shall we talk about beginnings? Always a good place to start, isn't it? And there's a conventional sort of way of thinking about the history of Northumbria, that it begins with the said Ethelfrith, king of Bernicia, who took over the kingdom of Deira, which then creates the unified kingdom of Northumbria. Deira, broadly speaking, Yorkshire; Bernicia, broadly speaking, north of the Tyne. His method for achieving unity in the kingship was to kill as many of the men of the Deiran royal household as he could get his hands on, and to marry one of its women, Acha. History has not recorded what Acha thought of this deal. Now, that may be fine for the period around AD 600, which is where we are. But notice that way of thinking about things takes as a given the fact of there being kings and the fact of there being kingdoms. We take that as a given and we proceed from there. But 200 years earlier, when the Roman administration, civil and military administration was starting to fall apart, there were no kings and there were no kingdoms. So it seems to be a sort of pertinent question to ask, how did these things come about so that by about 600 we can take them for granted? Seems pertinent, does it not? Well, we have some ways into this, and one of the starting points was in archaeology, the excavation that Tony Wilmot did in the 1990s at the Roman fort, the Hadrian's Wall fort of Bede Oswald. And what he saw was that in the late Roman period, the granaries in the fort were repurposed. Superstructures were taken down, but the basic footings and floorings of the fort were reused, and a timber structure was built on top of it. And if you go to Bede Oswald now, which is in English Heritage Care, they have actually put a load of timbers on there, so you can see the idea. And so you get a building emerging that, if we might think of it and talk about it as a feasting hall or a mead hall, and if you bring to your mind's eye the idea of the hall in Beowulf in the right sort of order. And that then remained in use in occupation well beyond the end of Roman Britain for, well, we don't know for how long. Tony thought maybe even into the 600s. So they didn't actually go away. You get that continuing going on there. So what's going on there? Let me read a bit about what we've suggested here. And we refer to another scholar who's studied the late Roman army and the sort of transitions of the late Roman armies into the 5th century. Rob Collins has studied the material culture of the northern frontier and sees in these structural adaptations a broader trend towards relatively smaller garrisons, perhaps of 120 to 150 active soldiers, stationed along the frontier during the 4th century. Their commanders were men of high status, reflecting increased independence and the roles that spanned civilian and military governance. They modified their accommodation and the internal structures of the fort as local need arose, to store produce rendered in kind, to act as assembly sites for those communities dependent on them. They were supported by self-sustaining industries and technologies. Public buildings were privatized, and headquarters compounds often turned to butchery, metalworking, accommodation, or worship. They increasingly preferred to build in timber, even if their new structures were essentially conceived on imperial models, where piles of animal bones scattered around former public spaces looked from one point of view like anarchy and squatting. From another, they look like the concentration of animals rendered as tax in kind, butchered, consumed, and perhaps partly redistributed through gifts and feasting from a central facility, the fort, where the commander now lived in the converted granary like a warrior in his mead hall. A late 4th century military commander, cut off from regular supplies and coin for salaries, severed from the political control and direction of his commissars, and already embedded within a civilian community to which his soldiers belonged, must needs make do. Farmers and craftspeople within the hinterland of the fort find their produce requisitioned locally rather than taxed in coins at a distant market. Their labour is bent to refurbishing the commander's accommodation, to tending his cattle. In return, they are protected from the predations of rival garrisons and raiders from beyond the horizons. So what we're talking about here is the beginnings of a sort of lordship, and I'm going to use that term as a neutral term so as not to beg any questions about what does it mean to be a king. The beginnings of lordship, the beginnings of a relationship between ruler and ruled, that is small scale and local. No longer are people paying taxes in coin to a distant administration. They're rendering the produce of the land to the immediate local lord who is providing them as protection. The beginnings of a particular form of lordship exercised locally. And so we can then ask the question, well, what do we mean about locality? Again, conventional ways of thinking about this, as I've just said it, De Ira up to the T's, Bernicia beyond the T's. But that's really hardly conceivable. The guy your man in Bird, Oswald, in the 5th century, is working on that sort of scale. And we can ask the question, what does a local territory look like in the 5th or 6th century? And we have some great help here, because there's a great insight on which we've been able to draw from a historical geographer, Brian Roberts, who shows how we can have a sort of patchwork of lands that he called core lands, or cultural core lands. That's to say, areas of terrain that have been occupied, lived in, cultivated, cared for, settled, generation after generation after generation. Brian has a beautiful phrase about the land being warmed by cultivation. And he maps that to show not massive blocks of territory, but a sort of patchwork of small units there in the wider area of there. And we can see, for instance, we can see around the Yorkshire Wolds a core area of De Ira. We can see around the mouth of the Tyne a sort of core area of what we might think of as Bernicia. We also see a unit that we might call Catres, based on Catterick and into going into towards the bottom end of the Tees, which rather acts against the idea that this duality of Bernicia and De Ira is something that goes back a long way. Now we found this to be a very powerful tool that we can use not only to understand the emergence of these things that by the 7th century we can talk about as kingdoms, but also their expansion into the Pennines and into what today we'll call the southern half of Scotland. And we've made a tremendous amount of use of that sort of thing. So we have a sort of triad here. We can think of rulers, lords, the people, and a territory within which the engagement between people and lords are taking place. So what about the people? Where are the people? Well, it's perhaps slightly embarrassing for an archaeologist to say that, on the whole, we haven't been very successful in populating Northumbria, from the ways that we can do. And it's ironic that we find it rather more easy, we find it easier to find people dead rather than alive. And what I mean by that is finding them in their graves rather than in the places where people live. There's an archaeology of Anglo-Saxon England that goes back to the middle of the 18th century. But coming back to the idea of these core lands, in the De Iran core, Yorkshire Wolds area, East Riding, there is a very, very strong signature in the burial archaeology that kicks in early in the 5th century as a people of De Ira, the De Iran people. It's very, very strong. We can't find the Bernicians in their graves. We know very few Bernician graves, but De Ira, yes, it's very, very strong. And the study of the De Iran burial tradition goes back to the second half of the 19th century, and to the work of a Driffield corn merchant called Mortimer, J.R. Mortimer. Name familiar, one or two nods in there. And if you find this topic interesting, do go and look for his book from 1905 called 40 Years Research in the British and Anglo-Saxon Burial Mounds of East Yorkshire. It is stupendous. And we've reproduced one of his line drawings. So there is an archaeology of burial in certain places, De Ira very strongly, there that we can rely on. an archaeology of settlement didn't really start to come into focus until the 1950s, much, much later. And we owe a lot of that to an excavator called Brian Hope Taylor, who dug the kingship site at Yevering, there up in North Northumberland. And the thing that Hope Taylor did for us was that he showed how we could find the rather fleeting remains of timber buildings where the timbers had rotted away there and were represented now by nothing more than stains in the ground. Hope Taylor showed us how we could find that, and that's the basis now on which anybody, and I'm one of them who's dug these sort of settlements, we've all directly or indirectly, we're all apostles of Brian Hope Taylor from doing that. So an archaeology of settlement has not come in since till about 1950, and there are not that many settlements yet known archaeologically. They're increasing in numbers, and the most spectacular one, and here's something to watch out for, up at the north edge of the Wolds, West Heslington. Dominic Powsland has had a project running for about 30 years. The most extensive archaeological investigation, excavations, field work, geophysics work that's ever been done in this country. Absolutely stupendous. The whole thing is not yet published. I mean, it's quite a complex thing to see how this is going to be published. There are one or two interim statements, and Dominic has been very helpful to us in talking us through and allowing us to use some material that's not yet in print. But that's really how archaeology goes about that. But what about texts? Can we find the people in the texts? Well, I have to say this to you. The title of Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English people. No, it's not what it says. The people are hardly represented in Bede's Ecclesiastical History. Noise is off from time to time. They get dunked in the River Swale and the River Glen by Paulinus in mass baptisms in the 620s, but that's about it. Very few. It's about elites, kings, princes, bishops, abbots, mostly chaps. So what about the women? Well, we do get actually one or two insights into the ways in which a queen can work within these warrior societies. But Bede's story really is the story, of course, of the conversion to Christianity, the conversion of the English people. And it does appear that Christianity did provide some sort of opportunities for elite women, and again, we're still in the realms of the elite, the ones that we know about, we're still in the realms of the elite. Elite women going in as abbesses to monasteries. Particularly, there was a strand of monasticism that came out from Gaul, the Merovingian France, that came into England, of double monasteries, men and women, ruled over by a royal abbess. And of course, the great figure that we know about in that context is the Abbess Hild. We might be able to talk about the Abbess Hild later on. They provided a refuge for widowed queens, and there were plenty of those around because the kings tended to get themselves killed on the field of battle there. Widowed queens going in, usually as abbesses, at least as a courtesy title. And maybe also a sort of alternative path for women who, for whatever reason, did not go down the traditional role that's there for elite women in royal households, even until the 19th century, as being pieces on the chessboard of diplomatic marriage alliances. You could bypass that. The most spectacular case of bypassing that is the daughter of King Oswald and Alflad, who at the age of 1 year old was dedicated by her father to God and put into the care of the Abbess Hild, already mentioned there, in thanksgiving for his victory over King Penda of Mercia. I don't suppose she had much say in that. Alfred, I think, is an interesting character, and I wish we knew more about her there. And thinking of Hild and her position at Whitby. I mean, she's most closely associated, most widely known in an association with Whitby there. There was something very interesting going on in Whitby in the later part of the 7th and into the 8th century. We already said Alflad was there, and after Hild died, Alflad became the abbess there. Alflad's mother, Eanflad, entered the monastery when her husband, Alflad's father, Oswald, was killed. Oswald was buried in the monastery, and while Eanflad and Alflad were there, Eanflad's father, Edwin, had his remains picked up from the field of battle a long time ago and brought to the monastery as well. So quite a lot of stuff going on there. Let me read you just what we put about it. And there's an interesting point here. With kingly sponsorship of monasteries, a new way opened up. A new way opened up for curating the memory of kings and thus for dynastic assertiveness. In East Anglia, in the pre-Christian and early Christian times, the ruling dynasty had achieved this through ostentatious burial rites and monumental features in the landscape at Sutton Hoo as long-term visible memorials. There is no evidence from either archaeology or texts that Bernician or Deirian kings had used such means. But the monastery now afforded institutional settings for demonstrative and possibly competitive display and post-mortem commemoration curated by members of their families. Female members feature prominently, who were occupying senior positions in the monasteries. Eanflad, while she was queen, was instrumental in setting up a monastery with implications for the politically sensitive power relationships between the Bernician and the Deirian dynasties when she compelled King Oswiu to pay the blood price for murdering her kinsman Oswine by endowing a monastery at Gilling. As widowed queen, she joined her daughter Alflad in the monastery at Whitby, and there Oswiu was buried, while his wife and daughter kept his memory alive. When Eanflad died, she was buried along with him. While Eanflad was alive, Whitby became the burial place for her father, King Edwin also, after his remains were recovered from the battlefield of Hethfeld of some 50 years previously. His granddaughter, Alflad, as abbess, took the commemoration a stage further by committing it to writing when she commissioned the life of Pope Gregory, which includes a section on Edwin. If fragmentary inscriptions from a crosshead in Whitby and a cross shaft at Hackness have been correctly interpreted, it seems that Acha, Edwin's sister and Oswiu's mother, was also commemorated in Whitby, and Athelbor, Edwin's queen, mother of Eanflad, grandmother of Alflad, was commemorated at Whitby's daughter house of Hackness. Alflad was the curator of the post-mortem memorialization of her family, and in this, she gave focus to the Deirian female line. Keeping it in the family. How are we doing? I've talked quite a bit. 3, 5? I mean, it's very tempting to stay in the 7th century because, of course, we have such a richness of detail there. And it does sometimes seem as though after Bede, Northumbrian history drops off the edge of a cliff. And we also have the problems that in the 8th and particularly in the 9th century, the kingship got very much destabilized, and we have a whole lot of short-lived, contested reigns of kings. But underneath that, there were some islands of stability, and I want to mention very quickly just two. In a 20-year reign in the 8th century of Eadbert, and a possibly 30-year reign in the 9th century of Eanred there. And there are two reasons for mentioning those. One is that both had a strong working relationship with the archbishops of York. And remember, in 735, the bishopric of York was upgraded to an archbishopric, where it's remained ever since. In fact, Eadbert and Archbishop Egbert were brothers. But the other point is, these kings issued coinage there. And this is a field of study that's been quietly developing over some years, stimulated by metal detecting finds that had been reported under the Portable Antiquities scheme. Now, numismatics, the study of coinage, is a highly specialised subject there. But it seemed to us that this subject has got far enough advanced that we could see whether we can try and use that to understand what's going on in the 7th and 8th century, where a line in through political history doesn't get us very far. And just to say this very briefly, we've then, and I think this is the first time that this has been done, we've mapped the distribution of the coinage of these kings and for Ulfrith as well there. And if you look at these maps, what we see is, one, very strong Deiryn focus to this. They hardly appear in Bernicia at all, which makes us wonder what on earth is going on up there. It hardly there is Deiryn, but also not only Deiryn, these coins are circulating further south into England, into the world of Mercia and beyond. And remember, in the 8th century, Mercia is the great dominant power. And this is also the time when, as we've known for some time, the great trading emporia, the Wicks, are starting up. So we have Ipswich, London Wick, Hamwick, and here in York, Eorphan Wick. And across the sea, Quentovic in northern France, and Dorstadt on the Rhine. So there's a great sort of economic, mercantile development in there. And the Deiryn coinage is really well focused in that. And we can put that, there isn't time to talk about this in any detail, but just to say we can put that also alongside the economic thing, alongside another sort of line into what we might think of as cultural life that's available to us. That's to say, through the examination of ecclesiastical sculpture. And again, there's a particular strand of ecclesiastical sculpture that's there in Deira that's quite different from the high crosses of Lindisfarne or Wearmouth Jarrow or Hexham or anything like that, that has linkages down into Mercia. Has anyone seen that lovely panel at Hovingham? Go and see it. Lovely panel at Hovingham there. And you can see those connections, and also connections into the Europe of Charlemagne. So while we might go in, while the instability of kingship might make us think that, particularly in the 9th century, there's a sort of Northumbria is really on the slide, when we use the coinage to get a handle on economics and trade and business, and the sculpture together to get a handle on culture, ecclesiastical sculpture, we find that there is vibrancy, and it's Deiryn-centred, and it is well connected elsewhere into England and also onto the continent of Europe. And I think that's enough that I should say at the moment.
Thank you for a splendid talk. I've just been sort of captivated by the way you've evoked both concrete detail, but also the mystery of where are the people in Bernicia, and then also this incredible project of sort of, as you said, curating commemoration at Whitby.
Yeah. Whitby is very special, not just for 664, which is the whole thing in itself, but yes, Whitby is rather special. Yeah.
What is special about Whitby? Is it the geography?
Well, coastal monasteries, really. It's one of a whole series of coastal monasteries. And I think it's quite clear that particularly on the east side of the country, the best way to get around from north-south is by sea. And if you plot the coastal monasteries, you can see the trade routes, you can see the routes, which may well have been a lot better than using what was left of the Roman roads. So, of course, the Roman roads were around there. So it's partly that. I think it's also to do with Hild, who was, I think she was exceptional. and we see, really what we see with Hild is somebody, can we talk about Hild?
Yes,
please
do.
Are we happy to talk about Hild? Bede says her life divides into two halves, okay, and we pick her up about to join her sister in a monastery at Shell near Paris. Her sister was a widowed queen of East Anglia, point I was making. But Aidan, the Bishop of Lindisfarne, somehow Aidan knows about Hild, and they've never quite worked out how that worked. And Aidan didn't want her to go. Aidan called her back and set her off on what looks like a sort of career path, almost like a sort of civil service career path. Set her up in a small religious establishment with a small religious establishment somewhere along the River Wear. Then moved her to Hartlepool, where there was already a monastery established, by the first nun in Northumbria, Hild, and then moved her on to Whitby. Both times, she wrote the constitution for those monasteries there. Remember, the monasticism was not standardized that period of time. So the sort of intellectual heft to be able to write the constitution. And at Whitby, what was she doing? She was training the next generation of bishops in the church. Bede mentioned six people who became the next generation of bishops in the church. And then when King Oswald wanted a safe pair of hands to handle the most sensitive religious political decision of his career, what system we were going to adopt for accepting the date of Easter, to whom did he turn? Whose were the safe pair of hands? Hild at Whitby. And I think that's the answer to your question.
Remarkable, yeah. Thank you. Should we take more questions? Or
Yes, yes, please.
May I ask a question about the names of the two parts of the kingdom of Northumbria, here and Berenice? I've heard it said by the author of the Little Kingdom that those names are Welsh.
They do. They're not English words. They're from the British, Brittonic language, whatever we like to call it, that preceded the English language, that have preserved and carried on, which carries the idea that there were, let's just say, identities, polities, whatever you like, there, that were already in existence, and that what we think of as Anglo-Saxon kingship or organisation then adopted them and carried them forward. So yes, they are Brittonic terms. Welsh is the Welsh and Cornish and what have you are the current survivors of the language that was spoken, the native language that was spoken in and around the edges of the Roman province. English, foreign language.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. Thank you very much. A place called Heavenfield was on a TV programme, Pilgrim's Route, Oswald's route.
All right, didn't
yes,
it?
It was.
Yes, there's a long-distance footpath.
That's right, yeah, and it goes past
There's a Cuthbert one and there's an Oswald one.
And I had an awful trouble trying to find it. I did find it in the end.
Oh, yeah, go on.
Yeah, and it's near, I forgot where it's near now.
Well, it's near Hexham.
Yeah, near Hexham, yeah.
Well, it's along Hadrian's Wall.
It's along the B Road.
Yeah, there's a B Road,
that's right,
yeah.
the Wall Road, yes, on there, yeah. Not so far from where those trees were cut down. I think it's in that area, I'm not sure. Anyway, that's all.
Yeah,
That's very short.
yeah.
Thanks very much. Moral statement.
Northumberland County Council have erected a cross there. It's not Oswald's cross, but there is a cross there now.
Just going back to the first question about the Brythonic language
go on.
being the origin of the names of the two kingdoms. So that's in the 4th century when you start your story. By the end of your story in the 9th century, it's firmly Anglo-Saxon and the language would have been Old English.
The language is English.
When would the transition have taken place, do you think?
Hey, listen, I'm not a linguist, and I really don't know. I really can't answer that. Do you have any ideas on that, Mary?
So, a few years ago, Claire Stancliffe gave some talks about these issues, and she suggested that there was much more persistence of the non-Anglian population, and that just hasn't been
And the
properly recorded
evidence,
or acknowledged.
and the evidence for that, which this is partly an answer to your question, the evidence for that comes in place naming. The names of places that have come down to us today, some names clearly are Germanic names, starting from Old English, but there are some names around that came from the Brittonic languages that are still
Elmet,
there.
for instance?
River names, for example.
Well, yeah, the river names, of course,
Derwents
yeah.
and
But
Tynes and
the
all
area
that.
Elmet, just not far from here, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. It's quite clear, Daeron take over in Elmet early in the 7th century, and the evidence there is very good for there being British, Brittonic, use whatever language, entity and kingdom that's in there. And if you look at the place name evidence, Elmet is sort of just going across into the going west of the Vale of York. Leeds is within Elmet there and down to Sheffield there. So you're coming into the edge of the Pennines. If you look at the place names there in Elmet, modern place names, that have come through, there's quite a lot of Brittonic place names in Elmet. Go to the Daeron heartland, East Riding, York. Apart from the rivers, there are no Brittonic place names. It's all English place names. So, but we have the place names because they come down to us. What we simply don't have available to us is the day-to-day language that people spoke, because that never got written down. And the writings that did get to us were not in English anyway, they were in Latin. So there we are. But place names are the best way into that question.
Oh, over here. Over here.
Thank you. There's lots of things I'm intrigued by your talk, so thank you very much for that. I look forward to looking into some of them. But one of the holes that I think you left dangling in front of us was the shift from lordships to kingships. Have you any thoughts on how that gap is filled?
Well, as I said, I used the word, the guy in the fourth row there wanted to put your hand up, that one. As I said, I used the word lordship as a neutral term there, so as not to beg any question. By the 6th century, by AD 600 or so, what I call lordship at the early period, they are referred to as kings, reges, in the Latin term. So it's the same thing. It's the relationship of protection and dependency between a ruler and the people there. And it's a different sort of relationship from the relationships that were there under Roman imperial administration, where you have this whole sort of imperial superstructure. And as I was saying, people render taxes in coin to who knows where. It's all much more personal, it's much more local, and it's there centered. We know who the Lord is, we know who the people to whom we are paying renders, and we can expect these people to look after us. And if somebody else like Penda is causing a nuisance there, we can expect them to go and protect us. It's the same thing there. Yes, sorry,
Thank you.
Pete.
Yes, you mentioned a lack of evidence of death of people in Bernicia.
Yeah.
I wonder how you explain that. I wondered
Well,
if it might be to do with different burial practices, such as cremation.
Yeah. No, it's not absolute. It's not absolute. But what the if we look at the archaeology of Yorkshire, there, and particularly in the East Riding, to a lesser extent in other parts of Yorkshire. There were communities set up, cemeteries of the sort that we'd understand now, with lots of people buried in there, men, women, youths, children. We never find neonates, and we never find people up to the age of about 4 or 5. Something different's happening there. And they may be in use over several generations. Community cemeteries. Now, for whatever reason, we simply don't know what the reason is. Further north, they weren't doing that. And it's much easier, discovery, a lot of this depends on the discovery, and some discoveries are purposeful. Archaeologists go out with some purpose to look for things. A lot of discoveries are accidental. And it's much easier, really. If there's a big cemetery with dozens or hundreds of things, there's a higher chance that somebody might come upon them than if we get just single individual there. It's not to do with the difference between cremation and inhumation, which is an interesting point. The earliest of the Daeron burials are cremations, and they're then picking up an early tradition that we see coming in. It's there in Lincolnshire, it's there in East Anglia, it creeps into Nottinghamshire there. Big cremation cemeteries there. Don't really get north of the Humber. There are a few early cremations in the Wolds area, as I say, but mostly it's inhumation. The body's laid out there. People apparently put in the grave, apparently dressed, so that typically in the female graves there will be lots of dress fittings. And I said there's a sort of archaeology of burial going back to the middle of the 17th century. What they were really interested in, of course, was the shiny objects, nice gold brooches and things like that. Still the case for some people. But people seem to be buried with their clothing. Men had different sorts of accoutrement, and for reasons that have been much thought about, a lot of chaps are buried with a spear, even though they're not, doesn't necessarily mean they're a sort of military men. The apex of the warrior burial is, of course, the famous Sutton Hoo grave, where the whole shooting match is there. But that's how we find them. The cremation's usually put in an urn, and the cremated bone in an urn, and then just in a small pot in the ground.
Are there any areas that you didn't talk about that you would have liked to? As I was preparing this, I thought, dare I say anything about Alcuin? Mary knows much more about Alcuin than I do, because, of course, really, I shouldn't come to York and talk about the 8th century and connections to the Europe of Charlemagne without mentioning Alcuin of York. Hey, and listen, let's not be too frightened by Alcuin. As well as the heavyweight intellectual stuff, can I call it heavyweight intellectual stuff? He was a great letter writer. And there's great gossipy stuff in his letters, going on about other people, and they all had nicknames for each other, doesn't they? And also, you get sort of shopping. Oh, I'm sending you this, and the other gifts. And will you send me some stuff? And we have references to all sorts of bits of stuff that are circulating around. There's a sort of whole economy of small gifts going around that we otherwise wouldn't know about, would we, either from other texts or from archaeology. And Boniface is the same. Boniface, the missionary, a little bit earlier, who went on to the continent of Europe. He, too, was a prolific letter writer. Writes back and says, the letters to the Abbot of Wearmouth Jarrow. Will you send me some of the works of Bede there? And he has a shopping list of Bede's works that he wants sent out. And then there's a very poignant letter back from the abbot saying, it's been a terribly hard winter on the island this year, and the hands of the scribes have been frozen, but we've done the best we can, and these are the books we can send you. Yeah, Alcuin's letters are gorgeous, and there is a collection available in translation, well worth reading. Where would the archaeologists be without the texts?
Well,
and the letters.
They complement each other. They complement each other, do they not? Yeah. Yeah. So yes, I would have mentioned Alcuin in deference, but I wouldn't have said too much about Alcuin in deference to you. Yeah.
Are there more questions? Yes.
Oh, I was half expecting some nods in the room. Hovingham, yeah. In the church there, south aisle, just above the altar, there's a panel, rectangular panel, about so long. 8th century carving, absolutely gorgeous. Yeah, it's a bit, it's been outdoors, and it's a bit worn. It's an arcaded thing, so you've got 8 panels in arcades there, and in each panel is a standing figure. And if you read learned people who understand these things say it has Marian implications to it. The figures there represent represent Mary and stuff. It's an absolutely gorgeous little piece, and it is well worth the trip to Hovingham to see that. And I said very briefly that I mean, Hovingham is the best example. It doesn't really match the sort of stuff that was going on in Lindisfarne, Weymouth, Jarrow, or Hexham. It does look more like what's going on in Mercia. And if you were to go, has anybody been in Leicestershire to Bredon on the Hill? Yeah. Well, if you've seen the sculpture at Bredon on the Hill, I mean, the Hovingham thing is clearly, you know, in broad sense, it's clearly of that ilk. There. Yeah, do go to Hovingham. And the other one that you must go and see, one of the points that the late Jim Lang, a very fine scholar of these things, made, is that in those Daeron sculptures, you get figures of the apostles represented, which was a new development, really. Earlier on, we'd got all sorts of figures, but tended not to be apostles. And that is another sort of linkage with what was going on in Carolingian Europe, representing the apostles, and the ways in which the sculptors were carving had affinities with what was going on in Carolingian Europe. And the argument that Jim Lang came up with was in connection with the apostles, is that as the bishopric of York had been upgraded 735 to an archbishopric, that's when York started to become a serious player in Anglo-Saxon England, isn't it? If we look at the 6th, 7th century, York's not really featuring very much. Jim Lang suggested that the Church of York became interested in the apostles as a way of saying, we're getting back to the very roots of Christianity and the teaching authority of the apostles, which is now vested in the Archbishopric of York. And I think that was a very, very good argument. Otley. The best of them is in Otley. There's a sort of, a bit of a shaft there, a sort of circular thing and shaft. And you've got, in the bits at the side, you've got 2.5 people there. Go and see go to Hovingham and go to Shotley. There you are, 2 days out for you during the summer.
Wonderful. Thank you, Colm, for amazing talk and also for answering the great questions so well. I'm sure many people will want to get hold of this splendid and very readable book with many new findings. So there's a table back there where the book is for sale, and Colm will be signing copies. Okay. Thank you all for coming today. Check the festival brochure for more events to come. Thank you.
Thank you.